I'm Richard Baker. I'm president of the Pelican Island Audubon Society. And many thanks to our sponsors. You all should have a flyer or a schedule of the speakers tonight. In the back of it, it has the donors that we contributed a large amount of money for this project. And we're happy that to hold this first conference since COVID. So we skipped a couple of years, but we're hoping to get people back into thinking about native trees again and plants again. Our landscapes are really critical for our future. They're really critical. A recent report I saw that Florida has 341 endangered and threatened species. We are the second largest state. California beats us out a little bit in having the most endangered and threatened species. This dire state shows the need for this important conference to help understand Florida and what we need to do to provide protection for our plants, animals, and birds. Our speakers will help us understand what is going on and what we can do. I recently saw an article from the United Kingdom entitled, "Imperial Lawn is Dead. Long live the trees." This is happening in the UK. They are starting to get rid of some of their sod and lawns and start planting trees. And it was really Imperial England and France that really started this kind of lawn business that we have. In our colonies, when they came over from England, they sort of started us on that we must have a lawn, to show that we have some funding and stuff like that. So Britain has really seen its error and is starting to change, and I'm hoping since they were influencing us in getting our lawns, that maybe now they will influence us to have some more trees. I don't know if this is possible. We have some outstanding speakers today, and we thank them for their willingness to participate and inspire us to action. So let's get started here with the first speaker. And Dr. Craig Huegel, our first outstanding speaker. He's director of so many things, but the University of South Florida Botanical Gardens and owner of HawthornHill Native Wildflowers. He teaches biology at the St. Petersburg College, former faculty member of the University of Florida, where he co-founded the Cooperative Urban Wildlife Extension Program. He's author of 3 books, and I think he's going to have some out here on a table that you can purchase in the lobby, and you could get his autograph. So his title today is The Nature of Plants and How Plants Work. So let's have a big hand for Dr. Craig Huegel.
I want to thank everybody for coming out today. Make one correction, because I'm not going to talk about how plants work. I'm going to talk more about what this conference is all about. But I did write a book that's my 4th book with UF Press, which I did bring some copies that I'm kind of proud of, that does explain how plants work. After years of teaching botany and doing these kinds of talks, I realized that even folks within the Native Plant Society sometimes don't understand why their plant does what it does. And so that's what the book is about. And I will say, the last chapter, when I do mention, do plants have a brain, my ex-wife, and we're not exes because of this, thought that was the stupidest thing she ever heard in her life. But Charles Darwin's son started looking into that in the 1860s, and there's a journal about it now. So plants have to assimilate all kinds of information to make decisions, just like animals do. But they don't have a central nervous system, right? When you cut into your carrot, you're not worried about, did I hit the brain or not? But it is true that they have to take all this environmental information. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't evolution drive plants to have to collect information, make decisions, and then change what they're doing if it's not the right thing, just like we do? And they do. Plants are pretty fascinating things. And so if you want me to talk more about that, I'll come back next year. let's assume we do this. I want to thank Richard for inviting me one more time. And we're going to talk about transforming landscapes, because I think that's what we're all here for. And this, in a way, combines all of the things that I've talked about for 35 years now since I came to Florida, and maybe a little bit before that, and maybe my entire life as a little kid gardening in the backyard. Because what we do is important. And as Richard said, our landscapes are the future. So, do I have a clicker? I can do this all by myself. We have to move from traditional landscapes. Why is this traditional? I think Richard hit on it to a point, but we have decided that the natural world is either scary, ugly, or something else. I don't quite know what it was back then. I know what it's like now. It's scary to be different than your neighbors, right? I hear from so many people that, boy, I don't know if I can do this. I live in an HOA. I don't know if I can do this. My neighbors might hate me. What if I get snakes in my yard, et cetera, et cetera. There's always a reason why this is what we think of as civilized. And it's safe. And it has a sense of beauty to so many people that this apparently doesn't. But why wouldn't we want to live here? I'm not saying that we should go to the Apalachicola National Forest and put our houses in there. Thank God we didn't. But why wouldn't we want to take the little piece of property we do own and make it look like this instead of that last thing? I have no idea why, but I think we are worldwide starting to understand that nature is a beautiful thing. I mean, look at the world's biodiversity and the gajillion species that we've got, and it's just the most amazing, beautiful place in the universe, I bet. And we don't value it in the sense that we want to have this around where we live. But we can, and it's not that hard. And if we have a small yard like I do, people always ask me, this is not my yard. There's a picture in one of my books that inadvertently caption says it's my yard. It's hilarious in a way, because I'd love that to be my yard, but I don't. I have always, since I've been in Florida, lived in a traditional, typical subdivision, either renting or owning. I'm renting now. People think I'm nuts because I'm landscaping my yard, and it's not mine, but I don't care. I have so much fun doing it. And I feel like what I'm doing is important, and it is. Even in a small yard surrounded by neighbors that put gravel in their yard because even having grass is too much work for them. What is a sustainable landscape in my mind? It's these three things, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, we're talking about the composition of plants and features. Bird baths, whatever it might be. Things that aren't really plants that we incorporate into our landscape to make it sustainable. And my definition of sustainable is that we're creating a landscape that has an ecological purpose. It's not the purposes that so many people, probably none of you, but so many people have. The purpose of their landscape is not for the ecological value it's going to create, what impact it's going to have on the world around them, but their sense of aesthetics, whatever it might be. And then we have to have ecologically sustainable practices, and we have to manage it ecologically. So, composition of plants. We have a great selection of plants outside today. Thank you for the folks that brought those and made them available to all of us. Florida has the third greatest diversity of native plants in any state in the union. To me, it's astounding, and given the fact that Texas and California beat us. But think about how big those states are. And they have mountains and deserts and all kinds of unique features that Florida could only vaguely think about having because we're mostly flat and we're skinny. And we do go from oh God, I hate the term zones, but we do go from like zone 8, whatever that means, down to the tropics. People, this is why I hate zones. I'm sorry, I transgress, or digress, I should say, all the time. But on social media, I live in zone B. I don't care. What is the microclimate of your landscape? What can you work with? That is the answer. It's not Zone 9B or Zone 11. Those were created for vegetable gardeners wondering when they can start their tomato plants and they don't freeze. It wasn't ever meant to dictate what you can plant in your yard. So, we've thought way too long about composition in the wrong sort of way. We select plants based on their aesthetics so much of the time. You know, you wouldn't buy a pet without knowing something about it, I hope. You know, if you get a dog, you're all ready for the dog ahead of time. You've got this little cage or whatever you're going to keep it in. You've decided what kind of food you're going to feed it. You probably picked out a vet. You're all set to go and get it. And you buy a plant at Walmart and you have no idea how big it's going to get and what it needs to grow, but it looked kind of cute and it was cheap and I bought it and I'm going to find a place in my yard. That just drives me crazy. Why don't we go outside when we pick out one of those plants and we thought about it ahead of time? If I buy that lignum vitae, what does it need? What is it going to do? What is the function? The first step to creating any kind of sustainable, what I call living landscapes that makes room for the rest of the living creatures on this planet. The first step is understanding what is the role that plant's going to play. I've already got plants, so what are they doing? What do I still need to add? What do I want to provide habitat for? What am I missing? There's all kinds of people that want to give you a list. Don't take it. It's up to you. You have hundreds, literally hundreds of choices of things you can add, and it's not necessarily in the list of the 10 best X. You know, there's a big push about oak trees. I am not an anti-oakite, I am not against oaks. But there's over 20 species, and they do different things in different sizes and need different conditions. Are they all the same? No. And if I plant a live oak, I have made a commitment. Just like I did with my first child, oh, help me, God, someday he's not going to need me the way he does now. I made this lifetime commitment to this plant that takes up my entire front or backyard. Everything I plant is now predicated on the fact that I use that live oak that spreads across my entire yard, throws shade 12 months out of the year, and has a root system near the surface it's hard to add things to. My next door neighbor has 3 live oaks. I don't have to plant a live oak. Thank you, neighbor. You know, it's a great tree, don't get me wrong, but I don't need it. It's in my neighborhood. It's next door. What is missing in my yard? So we make plant choices. The composition of plants we choose has to be more than aesthetics. It has to include this function because we think about plants as being something that is attractive to the eye. Let me pick one more time, probably the 100th time I've done so, on the most useless plant I can think of that everybody puts in their yard called a croton. What does it do? Some of you have some. I have a rental property, so I have some Pittosporum. My neighbor won't let me get rid of it, so it's there and I'll live with it. But what does a croton do, for example? It's got colorful leaves. What does that do? Does it provide nesting structure? Not that I've ever seen in my life. Does it provide food or nectar or anything else? Do bugs eat it? Oh my God. My plant is being chewed by bugs. What do? Rejoice, right? You know, when I go out and I see a plant that's being chewed up by bugs, I know I've done the right thing. It's supposed to be, plants be evolved to be chewed by bugs and things, and they recover, but whoever taught us that our plants are supposed to never be chewed on and have perfect foliage, and that crotons probably do, and that means it's dead, it's plastic, it never changes. And that's wrong. And the property value issue that I hear about sometimes, I'm going to landscape, I'm going to sell my house, so I better call in a landscape person to come in and make it more attractive so I can sell it at a higher price. Oh my God, that's so wrong. So, we've done that. Down at the bottom, and you can read, you probably read it about 10 minutes ago as I digress off into another tangent like I so often do. Nobody here lives in that slide on the left, do you? It's called Rotunda. How in the hell do you find your way to the center of that thing? I don't know, but I wouldn't want to have too many beers. At least not too many beers, and then find my way home. So much of our development ends up looking like this, which you know when you drive into this development, you are not going to be seeing wildlife, right? I mean, there's no anticipation when I come home that something of interest might have all of a sudden appeared in my yard. And that's what so many of us face, unlike that little piece that was my former backyard with my fake little stream and my fake little riparian zone along it that things do live in. The thing on the right is sustainable. Plant composition provides these kinds of things. When we talk about choosing our plants, this is it. You know, as a wildlife biologist, because a lot of people think I'm a botanist, I guess that's a compliment, but I am a wildlife biologist by background. You know, all you got to do to give the standard wildlife talk is just say food, water, and cover and sit down. You can do that in like 3 minutes and it's all over, right? Because that is the key, but you have to understand what those things mean, because it is a little more complex. Not much really is a secret, but they provide food and cover. We're not going to provide water for most things by the plants in our landscape. So that's one of the features we would add if we don't have a water source into a landscape to make it sustainable. And when I'm talking about sustainable one more time, I mean that something that can last forever with what it is right now without any extra inputs, right? We talk about sustainable economics and sustainable farming, sustainable this, sustainable that. We're talking about sustainable landscapes. We're talking about designing landscapes that survive on their own without us having to give them supplemental things that aren't part of nature. But it doesn't mean we don't have to manage them, which I'll get to, I promise, before we're done. Native versus non-native, because I'm going to be focusing on native plants. But I am going to tell you at least one other time. When does it matter that something's native? It's not its nativity that's important. When I see people on social media say, is this native? If it is, I'm going to leave it. You know, I don't have enough hair left. I've been pulling it out for decades. That's not the approach we're espousing. It's not important if it's native, just because it's native. It's important because native plants have evolved with native wildlife in this state and the rest of the universe, at least this world we live on, for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, depending on where we're at. It's an evolutionary dance that all parties are a part of. And native plants were here and they've evolved to use them, but not every plant is the same. And we talk about choosing plants for their ecological function. We then also have to recognize that there are some non-native plants that provide an ecological function. I have a key lime tree. I'm not going to dig it up and throw it away because it's not native. You know, I don't know how many things I saw, posts I saw on social media when they decided that blanket flower wasn't native, from people saying, oh God, I got to rip it out of my yard now. Why? Yesterday it was doing just fine, doing exactly what you wanted it to do, and today you're going to throw it out only because it snuck in as a native plant and surreptitiously, and we found out finally, and we tossed it out of the club, and now we can't have it anymore. No. There are native pipevines, and there are non-native pipevines. Where I live, my non-native pipeline provides food for both species of pipevine swallowtail. It's not going to invade a natural area. It's not going to take over the universe. And it provides the kind of habitat conditions that I want in my yard for those two butterflies. And it's really hard to do that in my latitude with the two native that I could plant that nobody sells, but people do sell tomentosa. I can't get that to grow to save my life. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to grow it. It doesn't work in my yard no matter what I do, and I've played with plants for a long time, so I settled on a non-native plant that does what I want it to do. And if we're looking at plants for their ecological function, and they're not invasive, and they provide a habitat, some kind of feature that we want within the habitat we're creating, then I don't see the problem. And if that's heresy to anybody here, at least we're not burning me at the stake anymore. So what does food mean? This is a hawthorn. I call everything I do HawthornHill or something hawthorn because I love hawthorns. But food is such a varied thing. Because of this. This is Little Hip Haw. What an incredibly great tree. Someday someone in the Native Plant Society is going to sell this. It's so hard to find this plant. I grew a few from seed, and I treasure them in my backyard because when that thing is in bloom, it's providing food, right? We talk about pollinator gardens because that's a big thing right now. What is a pollinator garden? It's not a bunch of flowers. A pollinator garden has to recreate what pollinators get in nature in the spring. So many things that are designed to be pollinated by bees and butterflies and all the other pollinators in the world are trees and shrubs because most of the wildflowers aren't blooming yet. This little hip haw is providing food in the spring for so many pollinators. And then if they're there, it provides little tiny rosehip crabapple things because they're all in the same group that then birds can eat. So they provide food, plants provide food in so many different ways, and we have to understand the role then of that plant. When I pick on the croton, it's because it's never really providing food from foliage or fruit or flowers or anything else, any significance for anything that I want to live in my yard that's native, that could share the yard with me. These things. Fruit consists of all this stuff. That little hip haw provides little hips. What a great common name for it. Those little hips are small enough that small birds can eat them. That summer haw that I started out with is too big for any bird except a fairly large thing like a crow, maybe a jay, squirrels. Does anybody here have starving squirrels in their yard? I really don't have much against squirrels. I have this little wildflower nursery, and they love to come into my new flats and dig them up just for the sheer joy of digging them up. I swear to God, it's just fun for them. I know they're occasionally bearing acorns and things, but if I'm going to design a landscape for wildlife, I can't hardly begrudge the wildlife that actually decide to live with me. So I bite my tongue and I curse at them a little. Janie can say that, or can attest to that. But anyhow, they're small. They're bright red. Why do fruit turn bright red? They're green, right? Most of the time, most fruit are green. Tomatoes, all those things that we think about, almost every fruit is green. Why? Because it blends into foliage. The last thing a plant wants is to be eaten when it's not ready. If you're a vegetarian, I love to pick on vegetarians, and I have nothing against you if you are. I think it's great. I'm not one, but I respect it. But if we're a vegetarian because we don't want to hurt living, feeling, sentient organisms, what do you think that little embryo is inside that lima bean before you throw it in a boiling pot of water? It's screaming like crazy as it's burning up inside. Because those embryos inside that fruit, that's in my new book, they're alive. They're directing what goes on. They're directing when it's going to ripen. They're directing when they start eating that endosperm within that peanut seed, for example. All that stuff is going on inside its little brain, even though it's a little baby embryo, but it's a living creature. And so when I'm green, I'm not ready to go out in the world yet. Mom and Dad gave me this little parcel of food I can live on until I'm ready to sprout, but it's not time yet. Different environmental conditions trigger different reactions, but inside I'm there. So I'm this little embryo. I'm inside. I decide to ripen. I'm going to turn red most of the time. Sometimes I turn bright purple or blue. Why? Because I want the world to see me. I want to have somebody eat me. You know, I say this, and I probably shouldn't. It's not really politically correct, but Roger Hammer would appreciate it. But you know, when the sailors landed their ships, there were red lights down the street, right? I'm home. I turn red because I'm visible. I'm visible because now it's time for you to eat me. I don't want to get old and wrinkled and fall to the ground because I don't want to grow up next to mom and dad. Mom and dad don't want me to grow up next to them either because I'm going to start competing with them. If you have children, you know what I mean. I'm happy all three of my sons live in a new place now, and they've all come home to live with me for a little bit, and they went back. It was great. Thank you for staying with me, but it's time to go again, isn't it? I'm bright red. Maybe I'm bright purple. I get eaten. I'm ready. I get planted. I go through a digestive system, and I get scarified or whatever I need, and I end up in the soil. A squirrel plants me on purpose, whatever it might be, and I sprout. All those kinds of things. This is an ash. Seeds can be super important for all kinds of things. My wildflower, little meadow in my front yard, those seeds get ripe, and I leave them. Maybe they don't get eaten. Some of the native grasses I have are better than other native grasses. I evaluate what the role of those are going to be when I add my meadow. And I'm not going to talk about wildflower meadows today, but they have to have grasses, and some grasses have better seeds than others. That's why we have rice and wheat and barley, and we don't eat some of the other things. Birds do the same thing. Time of year. Do not deadhead your plants as soon as they're done. They provide habitat. They do all kinds of things in terms of providing seeds and time of year. If anyone here has a Chinese or Drake elm, what time of year do those seeds get produced? Late fall. What time of year do our native, except for cedar elms, which nobody grows, no native nursery to the best of my knowledge has ever offered one, so I don't worry about them. All the other ones ripen in the spring. In the spring, there's a paucity, there's a shortage of seeds. And so they become really valuable. And a native elm, whether it's a winged elm or American elm, is a really important food source in the spring. And a Drake elm is useless if you watch one, because I do. I'm all the time watching things. My ex-wife, different one. Are you going out to stare at your plants again, Craig? Yes, I am. Thank God I've got 15 minutes or a half an hour to do that, because that's where I've learned everything, almost, not from school. You know, all the best naturalists in the world are based, like John Muir, self-taught. They weren't taught in college. College is a good thing, don't get me wrong. Staring at things is the best. And if you stare at a Drake elm, my guess is you will never see a bird eat a seed off that plant. Because they have so many better things to eat. Would you eat a dry seed on an elm tree if you had some luscious fruit next door to feed on? No, probably not. But in the spring, when you don't have any luscious fruit left, it's really important. I go back to that little hip haw. It holds its haws all the way into the winter. Nobody will eat that. Nobody will eat a Dahoon hollyberry until I have to. You've probably never eaten any, but I do. They taste terrible. But you know, by the end of winter, there's not much left. And all those bright red things that are still hanging around all of a sudden become critical food for things that are going to migrate north. When I worked in Sarasota, outside my window, there were 7, I believe, Dahoon hollies. They were all females. Now, they had a boyfriend somewhere in the neighborhood, right? And they were always loaded with fruit. And every year that I worked there, a flock of cedar waxwings, probably the same flock or individuals that brought the new kids every year. But they would come right as they started to migrate north. And they would go from one tree to one tree to one tree. And after 7 days, every tree was stripped bare and they would get on the street. Because one day I followed them on my lunch hour. And they were down the street, another Dahoon holly. But nobody had touched that Dahoon holly. And no one would touch that little hip haw until they had to. Nuts. Different sizes. Those are squirrel food, right? There's a few birds that could eat this, but they don't have teeth anymore. Archaeopteryx was a model that wasn't maintained. And so when we're providing nuts, these are hickories, there's different sizes, etc. We need to consider what the features are and what might eat them. But a hickory tree, for example, feeds all kinds of amazing things like Luna moths. So, every place I live, I plant a hickory tree because I like Luna moths. And if I see a Luna moth once in 10 years, that hickory tree was worth every minute of my time. Oh, just back up. And of course, foliage. I see articles all the time. What can I plant the deer won't eat? Well, not much. But things like gopher tortoises and caterpillars. Doug Tallamy has made us think about anything seriously. It's the importance of caterpillars, right? And so if you have a butterfly garden, you have a bird garden. You have this whole pyramid that you need in your yard. Those bugs that are eating your plant leaves are significant because they feed birds that need caterpillars, and almost every bird feeds its young caterpillars. And so what do I plant to create caterpillars? It's not by accident, it's by design. At least I hope it is. Indirect food. Indirectly, I'm creating caterpillars. Indirectly, I'm feeding hawks, owls, by not using lawn poisons. A friend of mine used to feed her Cooper's hawks. They had all the Cooper's hawks in the neighborhood named Coopy Jr. They had this great tray feeder in their backyard. It was out in the open. You're not going to put a feeder in the open, right? But they had a feeder in the open, middle of the backyard, not a tree or a place to hide in. And it was a big platform covered with millets for doves. Coopy Jr. would come by pretty much every day and eat a dove. It was a great hawk feeder. They didn't really care that much about the doves. Indirect food. And, of course, that's a totally cool fence lizard. What a cool thing. And there's a cricket there. All this stuff. One thing that's missed in bringing nature home is the fact that we feed wildlife not just with caterpillars and not just with the 10 best plants that have the most caterpillars, but by everything in our yard. Because invertebrates, not just caterpillars, all this stuff. Where do birds go when they're on a pine tree? They're not necessarily eating caterpillars in the needles as much as they're going up and down the trunk looking for bugs underneath that flaky bark. Flaky bark trees are so much better than, for example, a maple with smooth bark that's never going to have that kind of condition where things are hiding underneath its bark. Leaf litter and mulch. Mulches. If you have migrating thrushes, ovenbirds, all kinds of things that I used to live to see that would be in my yard for maybe a week, where are they? They're not eating caterpillars up in the tree canopy. They're not on the bark of a pine tree that I planted. They're in the leaf litter that I mulch with. Are they in cypress mulch? Heaven forbid, no. But they're not under the environmentally friendly woody mulches because they don't decay. In a natural situation, mulches are real. They're leaf litter and things, and they decay. And when they decay, they provide nutrients. But they provide nutrients for all these soil organisms. They're absolutely vital to a healthy landscape that's sustainable over time. But it also then provides invertebrate food for all kinds of other things that need it. And dead wood. Cover can be complex, and I'm not going to delve into it too much, but cover is not just a thing. Because we need hiding cover, and we need nesting cover, and we need cover if you're a bird to display the fact that I really would love a girlfriend right now. All those things, and they're different. In the wintertime, hiding cover is evergreen, right? Because most of my little woods that I plant in the backyard is deciduous, and I'll talk about in a second a bit more. And I love that, but there's no place to hide. My flatwoods plum is leafless right now, and so the birds that used to hide in there before they went to the feeder I put up are sitting out in the open. I've created thickets in the past of evergreen plants, and that's where the birds really are in the wintertime. Cover changes with the seasons, and we have to understand, is our plant deciduous or evergreen, and how is it going to change as it gets older? You know, I see people using red cedar as a hedge. Oh my God, you know, I'm German, but I'm not Herr Mengele. It's wrong. What does it do? I mean, it's a 90-foot tree. It's wanting to be a 90-foot tree, so I go out every year and I take some electric or whatever, not a gas-powered, pruning shears, and I cut it back again. Ha, gotcha. You're going to be a hedge. There's so many hedge plants in the world. Why do it to a plant that isn't supposed to be? And cover changes by design. Which again, I'm not going to go into any great depth, but this is a rouge plant. Anybody here have rouge plant in their yard? Yay. You know what's a great plant? Those flowers attract all kinds of pollinating insects that could get eaten by all kinds of things that eat those invertebrates. It provides all this red fruit that's great for birds that eat red fruit. But if you plant one rouge plant, you're an idiot. Sorry, but none of you have. Why? Because it's all by itself. It's not going to do anything. But if you plant rouge plant to look like that, it is incredible ground cover, and it's going to be great habitat, and that's true for wild coffee. It's true for so many understory plants. Our design is what creates the cover characteristics, not just the individual plant by itself. Evergreen versus deciduous. Anybody here have native azaleas? You may have been taught that you can't grow native azaleas this far south, whatever it might be, because damn it, they grow up north, and I'm in zone 9B, and they grow in zone 8B. Boo. You know, I've grown every native azalea in the state of Florida, and I live in Pasco County, and they do great. It's microclimate. But the one thing I've learned over the years as I've killed a bunch of pink native azalea, because I have. And one last thing, you know, people say to me all the time, I tried that once and I killed it. Okay. I tried it 10 times before I figured it out, and I killed 9 of them. The native nursery people love me because I bought a new one, and there was really no harm, but I figured it out. Native azaleas need light. And the thing that I did wrong with them in the past was protect them, because it was a North Florida plant. And, you know, it gets hotter in Georgia than it does in Florida, right? That's why the Bible Belt is up here. It's not summer heat. It's not sunshine per se. Plants eat sunlight. That's in my new book also. They don't eat Miracle-Gro plant food. That supplements their diet, just like if you take a multivitamin. But if all you did was wake up in the morning and take a multivitamin, you'd die, right? Because you have to eat something else. Plants eat sunlight. If you don't give them enough sunlight, they die. They starve to death. And azaleas and all kinds of flowering understory plants need sunlight in the spring and in the winter to generate the energy, etc., to get the energy to generate flowering buds and to finish reproduction, all the things they need to do before they get shaded over again and kind of rest for the rest of the year. Deciduous plants let you do that. If you're going to be using flowering understory plants, because I think this is beautiful, but it's also functional. Hummingbirds use these, butterflies use these. I'm not going to make any seeds that any bird is going to feed on. I'm not going to create nesting habitat. Oh my God, I can't nest on those scrawny little stems. But it still is a useful plant for what it's there for, and having them next to me brings me joy, and we should never discount the need to have joy. It's really important. So, deciduous plants do that. So many people move to Florida. I'm from Wisconsin originally. So many people move to Florida thinking I'm now living in the tropics. I'm going to plant palms and tropical plants, and I'm going to have my grass green in the wintertime, even though there are warm season grasses that don't want to be green right now. They want to wait till summertime. We're going to do all those things. It's not sustainable, and it's stupid. It's not the way it is. We live in a temperate area, and things lose their leaves for ecological reasons that are really important. Water in a landscape, and I'll go through this quickly. This is Christina Evans' picture. I use some of her bird pictures here and there, and some of them are identified and some are not. She's a great photographer. And I will say that Christina Evans takes almost all of her pictures that aren't at Kissimmee Prairie Preserve. If you've never been there, go there, in a bird blind out the back window of her house, because she can see all this stuff in her home. Why get in a car, waste gas? That's not sustainable. Put binoculars in their car, drive 100 miles to a nature park so you can go bird watching. Well, bird watching in your yard. In my old yard, the one time I lost my job, people say that all the time, you lose your job. You know where it is. I knew where my job was. It was still down the street. It was just the economic conditions caused them to lay me off along with everybody else. I had time to go bird watching. It was really a fun period of my life, and I had close to 30 species of migratory warblers in my yard that year, and always were there, I bet, but I just never had time to watch for them. Every bunting, grosbeak, oriole, anything that comes through Florida was in my yard that spring migration. It was amazing. And they're in my yard. They're not in my neighbor's yard. Water, my old water feature. The warblers would line up in that little vegetation at the riffle, and that's where they would go, in that little shallow, flat spot. The water didn't move too quick. Black-throated blues and black and whites and hooded warblers every year would line up right around dusk especially, and they would take a bath, and they would probably migrate at night, and the next day I'd get a new crew of birds. That bird bath. I got a letter once when I was just starting at UF as an extension person. I have this gray water feature. Nothing comes to it except crows. What am I doing wrong? Sent me a picture. Anyone here ever watched Marlin Perkins' Wild Kingdom as a kid? I bet a bunch of you did. First of all, Marlin was never really there. They would fly him in to do a couple photo shoots where he'd put his binoculars up and pretend he was looking at it. And Jim did all the work. He jumped out of the helicopter. He wrestled the anaconda. He did everything. When they're out there in Africa, in those Serengeti, where is every wildlife? Marlin's not riding around in a Jeep hoping he stumbles upon a gazelle or something. He's at the water feature because everything comes to it, right? If I have a water feature that's dangerous, it's no different, except I have the neighborhood cat instead of the lion waiting to eat the bird that comes to the water. It's dangerous. Birds that don't know that die and leave the gene pool, and all the rest of them know it, and they don't use your water feature. So you don't want to put, what this guy had is he had planted it really thick with all this lush vegetation. It was the scariest damn place to ever go to get a drink of water or take a bath. Birds weren't using, except crows don't care. They're smart and they're big and they're tough, and so they would do it, but nobody else would. You don't put it out in the open. This is a summer haw, and it's backed up by a lot of evergreen saw palmettos and stuff. And in the summer, when the hawthorn has got leaves on it, they hide in that on those little thin branches, dive down to the water, leap back into the vegetation. The cover has to be close. It can't be in the open, and it can't be too close. So, if we're going to use native plants or anything, we have to maintain our landscape, which I will end with. And as I said, this is a black swallowtail caterpillar, and this is on curled parsley. Curled parsley is not native. I have some native carrot family things in my yard that black swallowtails use, but they only use it when they flower, and when they're not flowering, they're not getting used, but they will use parsley year-round. I don't like parsley personally, so I'm not going to eat it, but I keep some potted parsley in my yard all the time. It's not native. It's an ecological function, though, that it's creating. So, I'm going to jump because we're running out of time. This is not sustainable. When I talk to garden clubs, they look at this slide, and I do hear this little perceptible in the background. Like, damn, that's beautiful. I wish my yard looked like that. That's what I'm working towards, and I'm aghast at it inside, and I pick on them a little bit verbally, but there's nothing there. You know, when you look at those Southern Gardening magazines, those are not sustainable landscapes. They work all damn year with probably 50 gardeners to make that cover look just like it does, and the gardeners leave and the whole thing collapses and it looks like hell until the next set of gardeners comes in to make it look good. Landscapes don't look like that unless you've got millions of dollars and lots of professional gardeners replacing things constantly, and that's not sustainable in any sense of the word. So, what are some of what I call sustainable land use practices? Your plant has to be capable of persisting over time without a lot of inputs like water, fertilizer, etc. They have to be able to do what they would do in nature. Those azaleas have to flower and do what they're supposed to do. If they just live like a lot of my azaleas in the past did but never really flowered, it's not sustainable. They're not in the right place. They're not part of a landscape that I want. But where I've got them now in my new place, they flower every spring and they're growing really well, and they make me really happy because I don't have to drive to Tallahassee to see them. I can go out, have a beer in the backyard, and watch birds and be surrounded by things that I shouldn't be able to grow, according to some of my native plant friends, but I do because they're in the right place. And I don't water, fertilize, or do anything special to maintain them, and they're in the right place. And I mentioned mulch, but that yard is mulched. Those are needle palms and some ferns. It's really shady. That's in a slope forest at Torrey State Park, but it could be your yard. I landscape with leaves until my plants got large enough. I would get leaves from friends. I get leaves from neighbors. I don't know about your neighbors, but where I used to live, my neighbors would go out in the fall and they would rake. One of my neighbors wore a mask way before there was things like COVID and stuff, because she must have been susceptible to dust and stuff, and she would work so hard, and she would put them on the curb, and I'd walk across the street, pick them up, and say thank you. I felt really guilty, kind of. She didn't want the leaves. I needed them. That's what I mulched with. And leaves are supposed to break down in a year. That's what they do in a forest like this. And when they break down, they provide all those functions I said before. We need to mulch with this, not with things that don't break down. Mulch is not to beautify our yard. Mulch is a really important part of a living landscape. Something that's sustainable, because this forest is sustainable. And those plants get those nutrients and the soil conditions they need. And it feeds all those little... I write a chapter about soil in my new book because people don't understand how important all those fungi and bacteria and even some nematodes are in promoting plant health. Plant something that's been in a pot that you fertilized in the ground and see what happens. I work at the Botanical Garden at USF now, and I was growing out some black-eyed Susans, and they were about this big around. I stuck about a dozen of them in the wildflower area, and within about 3 weeks max, maybe just 2 weeks, they were this big around. The ones that are still in the pots are the same size. And it's not because I'm not fertilizing X. It's because they're in the ground with relationships that they absolutely need with mycorrhizal fungi and soil bacteria, etc., that allow them to be more efficient at gaining nutrients and grow better and flower better and produce more fruit and seeds for wildlife and to be the thing we want them to be. Because they're not in my landscape because I like black-eyed Susans as much as I do. They're in my landscape to provide an ecological function. Elements we can add. I used to be absolutely against this kind of stuff. So if you've been with me for 30 years, you're going, what in the hell happened to this guy? But if I don't have all the conditions I need because my landscape, what I'm working towards is a landscape where I don't have to provide any of these things, period. But my landscape's still young and it's not providing everything that it's designed to do. It'll still be 10 or 15 years. So I can provide houses for things that can't have houses in the landscape in where I live. I can provide the kinds of food that they need that's not available or supplement it. And those last freezing temperatures, I had a lot of birds use my bird feeder. And I don't have a lot of those kinds of seeds and things for them in the landscape at this point in time. So what is land management? And then I'm almost done. We need to understand that management, whether it's native plants or not, requires maintenance. There's just no way around it. There are so many people right now that I'm reading that talk about, quote, freedom lawns. Oh my God, that drives me crazy too. You may have guessed a lot of things drive me crazy. Janie back there can attest the fact that almost everything drives me crazy. I'm a very critical human being, but that's maybe okay sometimes. Freedom lawn, I'm just going to let grow whatever grows. Oh my God, no. Design it. Purposely select the plants that are going to do what you need and the diversity that you need and not just whatever shows up. And especially if you don't live in a natural area to start with, what comes up in my yard are all invasive weeds. And some of those invasive weeds are things like Biden's excuse me if you love Biden's, but to me, it's an invasive weed. It grows across the street from me. I don't need any more of it. And if I leave it alone, it's going to take over everything and shade out all of the other wildflowers I'm trying to grow. It's not welcome in my yard, even though it has positive attributes. So, several things. Our landscapes, unless we live next to natural areas or all they did was plunk your house in the middle of some kind of 5-acre natural area, does not have anything left in it that started off with in nature. The seed bank underneath your turf grass lawn are all lawn weeds that aren't necessarily what you want to encourage native or not. The soils have been messed with. The horizons that used to exist there are probably gone. The nutrients or whatever, if they brought in fill, you're really messed around with, right? Oh my God, the yard I used to be in, the gentleman that was married to my wife before me was really cheap. I mean, I got a lot of Scotch and German in me, so, my tendency is that too, but he had bombarded with it apparently, and he bought the cheapest fill he could get. You could not grow anything in there for 5 years. The first 5 years, everything I planted died. It slowly changed as we started to play with things, mulched it with leaves, etc. We don't have natural conditions anymore. We're surrounded by Brazilian pepper and punk trees and carrot wood, etc., and there's a constant rain of things that a natural area 100 years ago wouldn't have experienced. Natural areas experience it on the edge, but if you live in a typical sized lot like I do, your entire yard is constantly being bombarded. And I'll pick on one more thing, laurel oaks. If I left my yard alone and didn't maintain it, I would have 100,000 laurel oaks and I would have nothing else because the squirrels plant them. I don't know where. I have a laurel oak in my neighborhood. They're all live oaks, but somewhere there's a laurel oak and the squirrels obviously plant them. And everywhere in my yard I get laurel oaks. Everywhere I lived in Florida I get laurel oaks. It's not a bad tree, but I don't want it in my yard. Maintenance. How do I maintain natural areas? Well, first of all, hydrology is messed up. You know what hydrology is. It's the flow of water and how moist your soils are and all the rest of that. And most of the time they come in and they fill your lot so that it doesn't flood and we don't have natural water moving across the landscape. And the moisture of your soils and ultimately the nutrients that come in with the water is blocked or changed, and we have to deal with that. And second of all, most of us can't burn our yards as much fun as it would be. I'm always tempted to get one of those little individual propane torches, walk around my yard and burn little patches of things. But I know my neighbors would catch me and maybe they wouldn't like it. I know people that do it. But most of us, practically, we can't burn. But fire has such an important relationship with a living landscape. And if we can't burn it, we have to do something else. We need vigilance to maintain our landscape as it changes over time. We need plants that can deal with pests like aphids instead of us having to deal with them, because invertebrates are the foundation of all life on Earth, and we can't start using pesticides. Birds, that. Walk on this for the next 24 hours, your pet will die, you will die, your kids will die, everybody will die, but it's safe because we're nature's finest. No, we're not. We have to get away from this. And I'll just end by saying, what we do in our landscapes and what we do the rest of this conference, and what Richard and the rest of you guys do all the way up till next year, where we hopefully have another one of those, is a significant conservation thing. It's not a hobby. It's not a backyard wildlife habitat program where we're afraid to put it in our front yard because our neighbors might see it. It is a change in perspective. It is a new way of looking at the fact that we are part of nature and that we want the rest of nature to be able to live in relation with us, because it's fun, but it's also the right thing to do. Thank you very much.